Indigenous European religions, the collective term for the pre-Christian belief systems of Europe, encompassed a rich and diverse array of polytheistic and animistic traditions spanning the Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Greco-Roman, Baltic, and Finnic regions. These religions, deeply rooted in local mythologies, rituals, and oral traditions, served as the spiritual backbone of their respective cultures, reflecting the unique interplay of environmental, cultural, linguistic, and historical contexts that defined each society. Celtic polytheism, practiced across Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, revered gods such as Cernunnos, a horned deity symbolizing fertility and the wilderness, and Brigid, a goddess associated with poetry, healing, and smithcraft, with rituals conducted in sacred groves under the guidance of druids, who acted as both spiritual and political leaders. Germanic polytheism, including the Norse religion of Scandinavia, worshipped Odin, a god of wisdom, war, and death, and Thor, a thunder deity wielding the hammer Mjolnir, through sacrifices known as blots and a cosmology centered on Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting multiple realms. Slavic polytheism, prevalent in Eastern Europe, honored Purin, a thunder god linked to oak trees, and Veles, an underworld deity associated with cattle and wealth, with rituals performed at natural sacred sites like rivers and groves. Greco-Roman religion, distinguished by its literacy and organizational structure, venerated Zeus, a sky and thunder god, and Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, supported by temples and written texts such as Homer's Iliad and Hesiod's Theogony. Baltic polytheism, rooted in Lithuania and Latvia, centered on Dievs, a creator sky god, and Perkunas, a thunder deity, with worship conducted at fire altars and preserved through oral myths. Finnic religion, characterized by its shamanistic practices, celebrated Ukko, a sky and thunder god, and Tapio, a forest deity, with rituals at sacred stones known as sidas, emphasizing trance-based communion with the spirit world. These traditions, predominantly oral except for the Greco-Roman reliance on written scriptures, shared polytheistic and animistic traits, venerating gods and spirits tied to natural forces and landscapes. Common Indo-European archetypes emerged, notably thunder gods, Zeus, Purin, Thor, Dievs, and Ukko, who embodied power and sky, and fertility deities. Brigid, Freya, Mokosh, Zemina, and Demeter, who represented nurturing and abundance. Animal spirits, such as Celtic ravens symbolizing omens, Norse wolves associated with Odin, Slavic bears linked to Veles, and Finnic swans tied to the soul, underscored a widespread animistic worldview. Spiritual realms, including the Celtic otherworld, Norse Valhalla and Hell, Slavic underworld, Greco-Roman Hades, Baltic afterlife, and Finnic Tuonela, reflected a shared belief in an interconnected spiritual plane beyond the physical world, often accessed through rituals or shamanistic practices. The spread of Christianity, a monotheistic faith emerging in the 1st century within the Roman Empire, introduced a contrasting theology with core beliefs in one God as the Creator, Jesus Christ as the Savior through his redemptive sacrifice, and salvation leading to an eternal afterlife in heaven. Often facilitated by the Roman Empire's infrastructure, Christianity transformed these indigenous religions through missionary efforts, elite conversions, and syncretism, adapting pagan festivals like Samhain into All Saints' Day and gods like Brigid into Christian saints. This essay examines the historical characteristics and regional variations of these religions, the mechanisms of their Christianization from the 4th to 15th centuries, the Roman Empire's role in reshaping Europe's religious landscape, and the emergence of Christian-pagan hybrids as a historical phenomenon. It argues that this transformation represented a complex interplay of cultural adaptation and political influence, with Christianity and Roman structures fundamentally altering indigenous spiritual identities. The essay is structured in 4 parts: the diversity of pre-Christian religions, their Christianization processes, the Roman Empire's influence, and the historical context of Christian-pagan hybrids, concluding with an analysis of their lasting impact on Europe's religious history. Part 1. Diversity of pre-Christian European religions. Indigenous European religions, the collective designation for the pre-Christian belief systems of Europe, exhibited profound diversity across the Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Greco-Roman, Baltic, and Finnic regions, each shaped by unique cultural, linguistic, environmental, and historical contexts. These traditions, predominantly polytheistic and animistic, were deeply intertwined with local landscapes and tribal identities, forming the spiritual framework that defined pre-Christian European societies. Their rich diversity, reflecting a tapestry of rituals, mythologies, and cosmologies, offered a resilient cultural foundation that later influenced the complex process of Christianization through adaptation and transformation. Celtic polytheism, practiced in Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, centered on deities such as Cernunnos, a horned god embodying fertility and the untamed wilderness, and Brigid, a multifaceted goddess associated with poetry, healing, and smithcraft. Druids, serving as spiritual and political leaders, conducted elaborate rituals within sacred groves, relying on oral traditions to transmit myths and practices, with Ogham inscriptions used primarily for memorial or territorial markings rather than religious texts. Germanic polytheism, encompassing the Norse religion of Scandinavia, worshipped Odin, a god of wisdom, war, and death, and Thor, a thunder deity wielding the hammer Mjolnir, with sacrifices known as blots and a cosmology anchored by Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting 9 realms. Runes, carved on stones or wood, recorded brief inscriptions or magical symbols but did not serve as comprehensive mythological records. Slavic polytheism, prevalent in Eastern Europe, revered Purin, a thunder god linked to oak trees and warfare, and Veles, an underworld deity associated with cattle and wealth, with rituals performed at natural sacred sites like rivers and groves, preserved through oral storytelling by priests and elders. Greco-Roman religion, distinguished by its literacy and organizational complexity, honored Zeus, a sky and thunder god, and Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, supported by temples and written texts such as Homer's Iliad and Hesiod's Theogony, which provided detailed mythological and ritual guidance. Baltic polytheism, rooted in Lithuania and Latvia, venerated Dievs, a creator sky god overseeing the cosmos, and Perkunas, a thunder deity, with worship conducted at fire altars and sustained through oral myths passed down through generations. Finnic religion, characterized by its shamanistic practices, celebrated Ukko, a sky and thunder god, and Tapio, a forest deity protecting hunters, with rituals performed at sacred stones called sidas, emphasizing trance-based communion with the spirit world and oral transmission of sacred knowledge. These religions, primarily oral except for the Greco-Roman tradition's use of quasi-scriptural texts, shared polytheistic and animistic traits, venerating gods and spirits tied to natural forces and landscapes. Common Indo-European archetypes emerged, notably thunder gods, Zeus, Purin, Thor, Dievs, and Ukko, who embodied power and dominion over the sky, and fertility deities, Brigid, Freya, Mokosh, Zemina, and Demeter, who represented nurturing, growth, and abundance across regions. Spiritual realms, such as the Celtic Otherworld, a mystical plane of ancestors and renewal, Norse Valhalla, a hall for fallen warriors, and the Slavic Underworld, a domain of the dead, reflected diverse yet interconnected beliefs in an otherworldly existence. Only the Greco-Roman tradition possessed written scriptures. Others depended on priests, poets, or shamans to preserve their oral mythologies, highlighting a reliance on communal memory. Shared elements, like the thunder god archetype, suggest distant cultural connections, though tribal isolation and linguistic barriers prevented historical unification, as seen in the distinct worship practices of Zeus in Greece and Purin in Slavic lands. This diversity presented both challenges and opportunities during the later Christianization process. Oral traditions proved vulnerable to replacement by written Christian scriptures, yet the localized nature of these practices allowed for the adaptation of rituals and deities, laying the groundwork for syncretic blends. The cultural richness of these traditions, from Celtic sacred groves to Finnic shamanistic sidas, provided a robust foundation for integrating pagan elements into emerging Christian frameworks, preserving cultural identities amidst religious transformation across Europe. Part 2. Christianization of pre-Christian religions. The Christianization of indigenous European religions, spanning the 4th to 15th centuries, marked a profound transformation of Europe's spiritual landscape, reshaping its polytheistic and animistic traditions into a predominantly monotheistic framework through missionary endeavors, elite conversions, and syncretic practices. This process unfolded differently across the Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Greco-Roman, Baltic, and Finnic regions, reflecting the unique cultural and historical contexts of each area, with Christianity adapting pagan customs to establish its dominance and effect a lasting shift from polytheism to monotheism. In Celtic regions, Christianity gained traction under Roman rule in Gaul and Britain by the 5th century, with missionaries like St. Patrick playing a pivotal role in converting Ireland, a region outside direct Roman control. Sacred groves, once central to Druidic worship, were repurposed as church sites, and the goddess Brigid was reinterpreted as a Christian saint, her attributes of healing and poetry preserved within a new religious context. The pagan festival of Samhain, honoring the dead, transformed into All Saints' Day, a clear example of syncretic adaptation. Germanic regions experienced a later conversion, with Frankish missionaries such as Saint Boniface active in Germany during the 8th century and kings like Harald Bluetooth enforcing Christianity in Denmark by the 10th century. The winter festival of Yule merged with Christmas, and Thor's protective qualities were aligned with the archangel Saint Michael, reflecting a blending of traditions. Slavic polytheism underwent Christianization between the 9th and 12th centuries, notably with Vladimir the Great's baptism of Kievan Rus in 988, which linked the thunder god Purin to Saint Elijah and the summer festival Kapala to Saint John's Day. Greco-Roman religion transitioned following Constantine's legalization of Christianity in 313, with temples like the Parthenon converted into churches and the festive Saturnalia influencing the celebration of Christmas. Baltic polytheism, resistant until the 14th and 15th centuries, succumbed to crusades led by the Teutonic Knights and Jogaila's conversion in Lithuania, aligning Perkunas with Saint Elijah. Finnic religion, converted through Swedish crusades in the 12th century, equated Ukko with the Christian god, integrating shamanistic practices into a Christian framework. Missionaries strategically targeted regional elites, whose conversions influenced entire tribes, as exemplified by Clovis in Gaul and Vladimir in Rus, facilitating widespread acceptance of the new faith. Syncretism played a crucial role, adapting pagan festivals and deities into Christian forms to ease the transition, such as transforming Samhain into a Christian feast or reinterpreting Thor's attributes. Coercive measures, particularly in Baltic and Finnic regions, involved the destruction of pagan sacred sites, reinforcing Christian dominance. The lack of written scriptures in most indigenous traditions, except for the literate Greco-Roman religion with its texts like Homer's Iliad, allowed Christian codices to supplant oral myths, with Latin and Cyrillic scripts spreading biblical narratives across Europe. These processes underscore Christianity's adaptability, which enabled it to integrate pagan elements, such as seasonal festivals and local deities, into its monotheistic structure, establishing a lasting religious shift. The resulting syncretic practices laid the groundwork for historical Christian-pagan hybrids, preserving cultural elements like sacred groves and fire rituals within a Christian theological framework, reflecting a dynamic interplay of adaptation that shaped Europe's religious identity over centuries. Part 3. Roman Empire's role in Christianization. The Roman Empire played a pivotal role in the Christianization of indigenous European religions across regions under its influence, leveraging its vast infrastructure, legal authority, and cultural resources to facilitate the spread of Christianity from the 4th century onward. However, in areas beyond its direct control, the process relied heavily on missionary efforts and the initiative of local rulers, revealing a dynamic interplay between imperial power and religious zeal that shaped Europe's spiritual transformation. In Greco-Roman regions, the Roman Empire served as the central catalyst for Christianization. Emperor Constantine's legalization of Christianity in 313 through the Edict of Milan marked a turning point, while Theodosius's decrees in 391 to 392 formally banned pagan worship, leading to the closure of temples like Delphi and the conversion of iconic structures such as the Parthenon into churches. The empire's extensive network of roads connected urban centers, enabling missionaries to disseminate the faith, while the introduction of codices facilitated the spread of Christian texts, gradually replacing pagan works like Hesiod's Theogony. In Celtic Gaul and Britain, Roman infrastructure, including fortified cities and administrative systems, empowered bishops to establish churches by the 5th century, with legal measures suppressing Druidic practices and transforming sacred groves into Christian sites. In contrast, Ireland, outside Roman governance, witnessed an independent spread of Christianity through missionaries like St. Patrick, who relied on personal influence and local adaptation rather than imperial support. Germanic regions experienced a varied Roman impact. In Germany, the Frankish Empire, a successor to Roman authority, supported missionaries such as Saint Boniface in the 8th century, who leveraged Roman-style organization to Christianize tribes. Anglo-Saxon England adopted Christianity under papal authority, building on Roman ecclesiastical traditions, though Scandinavian conversions, led by kings like Olaf II in the 11th century, occurred beyond Roman reach, driven by local royal decrees. Slavic regions, particularly Kievan Rus, fell under the influence of the Byzantine Empire, a continuation of Roman culture, with Vladimir the Great's conversion in 988 utilizing Byzantine infrastructure, including the development of Cyrillic scripts to spread Christian texts. Balkan Slavs similarly converted through Byzantine missionaries like Cyril and Methodius, who introduced written Slavic languages for liturgical use. Baltic and Finnic regions, situated beyond Roman control, underwent Christianization through the influence of neighboring Christianized states. Lithuania's conversion in 1387 followed Polish intervention, while Finnish conversions resulted from Swedish crusades in the 12th century. In these areas, Roman influence was indirect, mediated through post-Roman Christian kingdoms rather than direct imperial rule, with local rulers and missionaries driving the process. The Roman Empire's contributions, roads that linked distant regions, cities that served as missionary bases, and literacy that enabled the production of Christian codices, provided essential infrastructure for the faith's expansion, while legal bans on pagan practices suppressed traditional worship and facilitated the construction of churches. However, Christianity's theological appeal, rooted in its promise of salvation, and the adaptability of missionaries, who integrated pagan elements like Yule and Purim into Christian forms, proved critical in regions beyond Roman control. This dual influence, combining imperial resources with religious fervor, shaped the emergence of historical Christian-pagan hybrids, blending rituals and deities into a new spiritual identity that reflected both continuity and change across Europe's diverse cultural landscape. Part 4. Historical Christian-pagan hybrids. Historical Christian-pagan hybrids emerged as a significant phenomenon during the Christianization of indigenous European religions, spanning the 4th to 15th centuries, blending pagan rituals, mythologies, and cultural practices with Christian beliefs to create a syncretic spiritual identity. These hybrids, born from the adaptive processes of syncretism, preserved indigenous cultural elements while adopting monotheistic principles, particularly the belief in Jesus Christ as Savior and the promise of heaven, across the Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Greco-Roman, Baltic, and Finnic regions. This fusion reflected a pragmatic approach to religious transition, balancing the rich heritage of polytheistic traditions with the emerging dominance of Christianity. In Celtic regions, early Christianization gave rise to Celtic Christianity, notably in Ireland, where St. Patrick played a key role in the 5th century. He adapted sacred wells and the Festival of Samhain, a celebration of the dead, into Christian sites and All Saints' Day, respectively, while the goddess Brigid was reinterpreted as Saint Brigid, retaining her attributes of healing and poetic inspiration within a Christian context. Germanic regions witnessed Norse Christian syncretism during the 10th century conversions in Scandinavia, where the winter festival Yule merged with Christmas, and Thor's hammer amulets were worn alongside crosses, symbolizing a blend of pagan and Christian identities. Slavic regions, following Vladimir the Great's baptism of Kievan Rus in 988, integrated Purim with Saint Elijah, a thunder-related saint, and transformed the summer festival Kapala into St. John's Day, reflecting syncretic adaptation. Greco-Roman regions saw Saturnalia, a festive period of feasting, evolve into Christmas celebrations, while temples were converted into churches, and pagan gods like Pan were demonized to assert Christian dominance. Baltic conversions, occurring late in the 14th century under the influence of Crusades and Jogaila's conversion in Lithuania, linked Perkunas to St. Elijah, with solstice fires reinterpreted as Christian feasts. Finnic regions, Christianized through Swedish crusades by the 12th century, equated Ukko with the Christian god, adapting midsummer rituals into St. John's Day celebrations. These hybrids emerged from practical needs to ease the transition to Christianity, as missionaries reinterpreted pagan gods as saints or archetypes to align with Christian theology, facilitating acceptance among local populations. Elite conversions, such as those of Clovis in Gaul and Vladimir in Rus, ensured widespread adoption by influencing entire communities, while rural areas often practiced crypto-paganism, secretly maintaining rituals like offerings to spirits or seasonal rites. The lack of written scriptures in most indigenous traditions, with the exception of the literate Greco-Roman religion, allowed Christian codices to dominate, spreading biblical narratives that supplanted oral myths. This textual advantage reinforced Christian theological supremacy, yet the syncretic blending preserved cultural continuity. No historical hybrid unified all European pagan traditions, as conversions remained region-specific, shaped by local dynamics and missionary strategies. However, shared Indo-European elements, such as thunder gods like Zeus, Purin, and Thor, suggest a potential for broader synthesis, hinting at underlying commonalities across traditions. These hybrids enabled communities to retain ancestral practices, sacred groves, fire ceremonies, and seasonal festivals, within a Christian framework, ensuring spiritual continuity and fostering a gradual acceptance of monotheism. This historical interplay of adaptation and integration laid the groundwork for a complex religious identity that reflected Europe's diverse spiritual heritage, shaping its cultural and theological landscape over centuries. Conclusion. The Christianization of indigenous European religions profoundly transformed the spiritual landscape across the Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Greco-Roman, Baltic, and Finnic regions, shifting a diverse array of polytheistic and animistic traditions toward the dominance of Christian monotheism. This transformative process, unfolding over a millennium from the 4th to the 15th centuries, was propelled by the dedicated efforts of missionaries, the strategic conversions of regional elites, and the adaptive practice of syncretism, with the Roman Empire's infrastructure playing a crucial role in certain areas. The resulting Christian-pagan hybrids emerged as a testament to this evolution, preserving cultural elements by integrating pagan rituals, mythologies, and deities with Christian beliefs, notably the promise of salvation and an eternal afterlife in heaven. The pre-Christian religions of Europe, each marked by unique gods and practices, relied predominantly on oral transmission, with the exception of the Greco-Roman tradition, which utilized written texts like Homer's Iliad and Hesiod's Theogony. Christianity introduced transformative technologies and structures, including codices for preserving biblical narratives, Latin and Cyrillic scripts for liturgical use, and stone churches that replaced pagan sacred sites such as groves and sitas. Syncretism facilitated this transition by adapting pagan festivals, Samhain into All Saints' Day, Yule into Christmas, and reinterpreting gods like Brigid and Purin as Christian saints, embedding indigenous spiritual identities within a monotheistic framework. The Roman Empire's extensive network of roads, urban centers, and legal systems supported the shift in Greco-Roman and Celtic regions, enabling missionaries to establish churches and enforce bans on pagan practices. Byzantine influence similarly shaped Slavic conversions, particularly in Kievan Rus after 988, through infrastructure and written language development. In contrast, regions like Scandinavia, the Baltic and Finnic territories, beyond direct Roman control, saw Christianization driven by missionaries and local rulers, highlighting the adaptability of Christian theology in diverse cultural contexts. Historical Christian-pagan hybrids, such as Celtic Christianity in Ireland and Norse Christian syncretism in Scandinavia, illustrate the feasibility and effectiveness of blending traditions. These hybrids allowed communities to retain cultural identities, sacred wells in Celtic regions, Thor's hammer in Germanic areas, while embracing monotheism, easing the transition through familiar practices. For instance, St. Patrick's adaptation of Samhain and the linkage of Purin to St. Elijah in Slavic lands preserved ancestral rituals within a Christian context. Although no unified pan-European hybrid existed historically, the presence of shared Indo-European elements, such as thunder gods like Zeus, Purin, and Thor, suggests a potential for broader synthesis, reflecting underlying spiritual commonalities across traditions. The lasting impact of Christianization lies in its ability to integrate Europe's diverse spiritual heritage, polytheistic vibrancy and animistic reverence, into a monotheistic structure, shaping the continent's religious history into a complex tapestry of adaptation and continuity. This transformation underscores the dynamic interplay of cultural preservation and religious evolution, leaving a legacy where pagan rituals and Christian theology coexist, influencing European spirituality to the present day. The hybrids stand as evidence of a resilient cultural identity that adapted to new beliefs, ensuring that the spiritual richness of indigenous European religions endures within the Christian framework that came to define Europe's religious landscape.